This week's The World Today will discuss the history, role, use, and the ethics of drugs and alcohol in warfare, both of which have been used in a variety of ways since the times of the ancient Greeks, and they continue to play a major factor in major and modern conflicts. You can find longer bios online, so I'm not going to take up a lot of time, but I want to briefly introduce you to our esteemed guest. I'm going to try not to butcher too many names, but Lukasz Kamiański is an associate professor at the Jagiellonian University and the author of Shooting Up: A History of Drugs and Warfare. He has served as a visiting fellow at LSE Ideas and the Center for International Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Claire Finkelstein is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy right here at Penn. She is also the founder and faculty director of the Center for the Ethics and Rule of Law, a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute affiliated with Penn's Annenberg Public Policy Center, where she is a distinguished research fellow, and she is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Jonathan Moreno is the David and Lynn Silfen University professor and Penn Integrates Knowledge professor here at Penn. At Penn, he is also professor of medical ethics and health policy, of history and sociology, of science and philosophy. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. You should know he's also like my own personal tutor on ethics and medical policy. Last but not least, our moderator for today's program is Beth Simmons, who's an Andrea Mitchell Penn Integrates Knowledge University professor of law, political science, and business ethics here at Penn. She's also a faculty fellow here at Perry Roldhouse, supported by the National Science and the Carnegie Foundation. She is currently researching the paradox of hardening international borders in an era of globalization. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our panelists to the stage, and I hope you are ready for a really exciting discussion.
Hello, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. So glad to have you here this afternoon. So this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the use of drugs on the battlefield, in the military settings during war. And there are a lot of issues we could be talking about. I think one of the main issues we're going to be talking about is going to be the mandated use of drugs on the battlefield, but there are a whole range of things we could be addressing as well. And we're going to be having it, so I guess we would almost say from three different perspectives. So down there on the end, Lukasz Kamiański has written the book that almost made me late because it's a page turner. It's very interesting to read. And it captured my attention. I looked up and it was 10 minutes till. We're going to we're going to hear from sort of the medical ethics point of view. We're going to hear from the legal point of view from our other two guests, Professors Moreno and Finkelstein. And just maybe to set the stage just a little bit, I guess my first sort of impression or thinking about this was, I've never given this much thought. Has anybody given a lot of thought to this issue of use of drugs on the battlefield? I haven't given it a lot of thought, which is very ironic because my husband is a soldier. And the only thing, he was in the Gulf War, especially the first Gulf War, and they had to take anti-anthrax, they had to take anti-chemical weapon kinds of compounds. And I suppose these were mandated, actually. I don't know that he questioned it very much, but I guess they were mandated. Performance enhancing to some degree. But frankly, I'd never given a lot of thought about this issue. But it turns out there's a lot to talk about here. And it turns out there's a long historical experience with drugs on the battlefield as well. And that's what Lukasz has written an entire book about. So these have included analgesics to relieve pain, intoxicants, stimulants, hallucinogens, and all of these, I guess, are made available under the general rubric of making war somehow tolerable. So war is a combination of the horrifically violent and the horribly boring. And it's navigating and negotiating those two pieces of war that find, the possibility and the potential uses for a various range of drug use of various kinds. And, so again, some of this is mandated and some of it is not preferred. And sometimes it's in this gray area between mandated and tolerated, or sort of not sanctioned, but yes, kind of tolerated in some ways. And so there are many issues around these kinds of issues, around this sort of range of drugs and drug regimes. So alcohol has been used, for example, as an incentive to fight hard. Amphetamines have been used to stay awake in very long kinds of deployments when attention is crucial. Evidently, both Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill used speed to stay awake during the long hours of World War II. And some militaries, have actually capitalized on the use of illicit drugs in order to finance themselves. So drugs enter at sort of many different places in the setting of war violence. And we can turn it over to our speakers to explore some of these issues. And in particular, I might begin with Lucas, if you will, Lucas, and that is to sort of, let me put out there on the table the question about, war is hell in a lot of ways. And I guess of all the things to sort of pick out and explore with respect to the conduct of war, why should we pay so much attention to drug use?
That's a great question to open up, but I wouldn't say we should pay attention. We could pay attention.
You have paid attention.
I did, because what struck me when I did some research on contemporary and future enhancements was that there was no single book on the library shelves on the topic. And I was like, oh, I'm shocked. It cannot be. So I started digging and digging and digging and nothing, no single volume. And I kind of got intoxicated by this topic. It drove me away from my main research. And this is how I actually became aware that the issue has been a taboo among military scholars, historians. There's very little on the subject. And that caused me to think why it was such a taboo. And here comes a lot of, questions concerning ethical issues probably and double standards. If a state, the authorities and the commanders issued drugs, particularly stimulants, to their troops, the very same substances that are controlled and civilians are not allowed to use, it creates a double standard, bingo, right? So it's better to keep it secret, not to generate social unrest or moral debates, so on and so forth. There's a quote that I would like to bring to your attention. It was made by a French historian, Thomas Bernan, who called for studying cultural history of alcohol in France. And he said that we can learn a great deal about society through the prism of wine glass. And I would say we can learn a great deal about war culture and soldiering through the prism of intoxicants. It somehow changes our perspective, and probably sometimes the history of particular conflicts and wars should be rewritten, taking into account this intoxicating factor. I mean,
I have a question real quickly though. When you say intoxicants, what are you referring to? So are amphetamines intoxicants as well, would you say?
yes,
Okay.
there are stimulants, but they are within this range of intoxicants, right?
What does intoxication mean?
It's changing how your brain works. Actually, intoxicants alert some neurotransmitter systems in the brain. So depending on whether it's an upper or downer.
Okay. So any kind of effect on the brain would be considered intoxicating, right?
That's right.
Okay, good. I just wanted to clarify that in case we were sort of wondering what kind of substances we're talking about, what kind of effects we're talking about. Okay. And feel free to jump in if you have something you want to add on that too.
Okay. I'm Polish, right? And I was totally shocked when I learned that during the German invasion on Poland in September 1939, German forces were issued something like 20 million methamphetamine pills. So it appeared that the blitzkrieg against Poland was not only a kind of dry run of blitzkrieg as such, but it was also a great field experiment on the utility of the use of methamphetamine under the trademark Pervitin. And actually, it proved very useful. It kept soldiers awake for up to 24 hours in some cases. And this is how many historians can explain the non-stop advance of German troops during the real blitzkrieg in spring 1940 against France and other European countries. I mean, otherwise it's unimaginable and difficult to explain how units could go on and on for like 100 or 150 kilometers non-stop. Doesn't it change our reading of the Second World War, for instance?
Yes. Yes. Would you like to add anything in terms of your thoughts about why should we be considering drug, especially mandated drug use in a wartime setting?
Yeah, well, so Lukasz, your book is so important that you're writing on the subject, and there's another book that I've just started reading called Blitzed, which is all about the use of these drugs by the Nazis and the experimentation that they did, from which I think we learned a lot. And he details very helpfully the sort of history of German pharmaceutical companies and how they were really poised to benefit from this big surge in the use of amphetamines and other sorts of drugs. So you're talking about alcohol use as well, but I'm just going to focus on the drug use for a moment. I think the real question for an ethicist and someone who thinks, as I do, a lot about the ethics of war and the ethics of enhancements in war of various sorts, is whether or not, number one, we think that this sort of benefit, if it is indeed performance enhancing, lethality enhancing, as you've suggested, some of the evidence from the Polish invasion suggests in 1939, that was literally sort of fueled by amphetamines. If it is performance enhancing, and we start to think about the possibility that the military may be contemplating of actually mandating its use in battle, what are the ethical concerns that we may have with that? There's some obvious ethical concerns around bodily integrity, bodily privacy, and so on. But moving beyond that, so if I'm going to be the likely naysayer on the panel, I have profound concerns about enhancement, increase of collateral damage and the effects on judgment of performance enhancing drugs in battle. I don't think that we have any hard and fast evidence, but, and one would have to await some kind of empirical evidence, not that we're going to be able to do controlled studies in this arena. But there is, we know enough to suggest that the use of specifically amphetamines in battle may increase the effacement of judgment, may make it harder to apply the principle of distinction in battle, may make people less sensitive to the possibility of collateral damage and civilian harm. We know this partly, of course, from natural training enhancement that we can do without drugs. There is some evidence to suggest that some of that training becomes particularly difficult to dial back in a situation when soldiers are deployed at close proximity to civilians, for example, in urban warfare, and that I expect that we would see the same thing with heightened use of amphetamines in war. So I put on the table that this is something we should be very hesitant about. And also, of course, it sets off tremendous worries about longer term health effects and many sort of knock-on effects. So.
Okay, great. Professor Moreno.
Well, I'm intoxicated too. First to be with my friend and colleague Claire on the panel, and in particular to be on the panel with Lukash, who I've known for how long? I don't know. When did we meet? Maybe
2015, I think.
2015. Well said. I was going to guess 18 years at a conference at Oxford. And I must say that although there are others who've written on this topic, Lukash was the first. And that book, Shooting Up, what a title, right? Wish I'd come up with that. But I didn't have the book to put behind it either. That book really is, it's quite remarkable, and I commend it to you. When my daughter reminded me a few months ago that when she was maybe 11 or 12, and I just picked her up from school, and she said, a lot of my friends are talking about using drugs. I'm not going to do that. And so this is one of those parental moments, right? Everything is really critical now. What do I say? So I said, yes, you will. And I said, oh my God, that was terrible. She said, oh, no, that was honesty. It was an honest response. So people are always changing their consciousness. Human beings have always changed their consciousness from moment to moment. Whether it's waking up or falling asleep, whether it's having sex or not having sex, whether it's alcohol, whether it's some leaf that you pick up in the woods, whether it's looking up instead of looking down, breathing, we're always changing our consciousness. So I think we need to set that down as a predicate. And then if you consider what Homer said about standing up in combat, literally standing up, right? When you were facing the person that you may have to kill if this person didn't kill you. That's a very unusual situation for a human being. We don't normally find ourselves in situations in which we will kill or be killed. So of course, anything you can do to change your consciousness is going to be of interest, maybe not necessarily of value, but certainly of interest. I got into this, and we've been talking about, I think, super soldiers in terms of aggressive measures. But I got into it when I got interested in what you might call countermeasures. So being a super soldier also means not being so vulnerable to weapons that the other side could use against you. Already, we think about the Nazi experiments. It's quite interesting that some of you who've taken a bioethics course, and certainly if you took it from me, you would know that as a result of the Nazi doctors' trial, the judges wrote what we have come to call the Nuremberg Code, and the Nuremberg Code's first sentence is, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Well, there is only one US agency that has ever adopted the Nuremberg Code as its policy for doing human experiments. You want to guess? The Department of Defense. Yes, we have an ironist in the room. In 1953, the Department of Defense adopted the Nuremberg Code verbatim as its policy for doing what was called at the time ABC warfare research, atomic, biological, and chemical, for preventive defensive measures right? That's a quote. So in case you didn't hear it the first time, these are for prevention and defense. So interestingly, the national security system in this country has thought about this for a long time. Now, were they thinking about the ethics? Were they thinking about lawsuits? We don't know. But we've been in this business for quite a while of thinking about how to use what kinds of measures to enable warfighters to be less vulnerable to the weapons that could be used against them. There are so many examples of this. I'll just give you, one or two. When you become a member of the armed forces in this country, you're getting a lot of shots. You're getting vaccinated for a whole lot of stuff. We talked about we can talk about the anthrax vaccine, which was highly controversial in the first in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, sometimes claimed to be part of what's known as Gulf War syndrome or Gulf War illness, the the actual origins of which is still very unclear. But this was a major factor in some of the first listservs in the 90s of veterans who complained about the results of getting the anthrax vaccine. Also, some of them at the same time taking an anti-nerve gas agent called pyridostigmine bromide. One of my friends who was a scientist in the armed forces said, a biologist in the armed forces said, the desert in Kuwait was littered with blister packs of pyridostigmine bromide, because as soon as those guys figured out that this is going to be a very fast offensive, they threw them away. It's just, you don't want to do that. So we do have, it seems to me, this is a two-sided coin, right? We have measures that will make you perhaps too aggressive. Very hard to know how to balance that in the actual situation. Lukash can talk more about this. We also have measures that are sanctioned by our system that can also, one hopes, make you less vulnerable if you're on the right side.
Good. Let me follow that up. I'm hearing a couple of issues that I just want to sort out here so that we can maybe comment on some of these. It seems like when we talk about the ethics of drug use by soldiers, I'm hearing from the panel so far at least three kinds of issues when we talk about the ethical issues. First of all, the question of whether it is mandated or voluntary. Second, whether it is tested versus experimental. And third, whether it is performance enhancing net. Okay. Now, what should we put at the top of the list when we think about the ethical considerations around drug use in a military context?
Well, talking about drugs prescribed by the authorities, I would put the dilemma benefits versus no harm. But we tend to kind of be sensational about the topic today. But let's be clear, there are not many regular militaries that allow and approve the use of stimulants. It's only the US military, I guess, that approves the use of so-called go pills only for pilots.
Why do you think that is?
The first thing is that the US has a long tradition of the use of amphetamines, which gets back to the Second World War. And actually, there's only one short break in this continuous policy, which shouldn't be, I guess, seen in terms of enhancement, because the military calls it fatigue management. So it's a countermeasure to fight fatigue, exhaustion during operations, right? So go pills help pilots stay awake and safely get back from the mission. So this is this first thing I would say. Long tradition with a very short period of break in 1991, 1996. The second I would say is that especially the Europeans are much more sensitive and more careful when it comes to drug performance enhancing drugs. But on the other side of the coin, we see irregular militaries nowadays that are going in a totally different direction, like jihadist terrorists and ISIS fighters and child soldiers, so on and so forth. They're all heavily high on different intoxicants. There are legends and anecdotes about ISIS fighters like taking amphetamine-like stimulant Captagon, totally unregulated, very liberal. And the drug was to turn them into zombie-like fighters. So another dilemma that I would say is that irregular forces being very reserved when it comes to the use of intoxicants, oftentimes face irregulars high on drugs, which makes the enemy much more unpredictable and also dangerous.
Look, Beth, I think we need to perhaps modify your third question a little bit, because the question, it's not an ethical question whether it's enhancing, performance enhancing or not, right? That's an empirical question, right? And I'm willing to grant, in the absence of any further empirical evidence to the contrary, that it's performance enhancing. So, right, we could just sort of assume this. I mean,
Not necessarily net, like you said.
maybe
because of the
not
aggressive
net,
behavior.
right? But in the short run, let's, sort of for purposes of argument, let's assume it's performance enhancing, because we don't get to the ethical question unless we make that assumption, the really hard ethical questions until we make that assumption, I think, right? But if we assume it's performance enhancing, then we get to some of the similar ethical questions that we have with a lot of enhancements in warfare, right? We have the flip side of this debate is a conversation that we have all the time about the use of AI in warfare. And I sort of think of the topic of super soldiers and the topic of AI and robotics as the flip sides of one another. Super soldiers is sort of, if you will, allow me to stretch a point, making robots out of soldiers, and robotics and AI is making soldiers out of robots. And we can ask exactly the same ethical questions, but there's an extra layer in connection with sort of human experimentation when we're talking about mandating these drugs. And one of the, profound worries that I have is, in general, is desensitization in warfare and civilian harm mitigation around that desensitization. You asked a question about the US. Why particularly in the US? The US is awash with amphetamines. I mean, if we're going to focus on amphetamines in particular, psychiatrists give it to children at a very, very young age. Very often you hear in mass shooting cases, and I hate to bring this up in this context, but mass shooters very often use amphetamines to steel their nerves for the job. We have massive uses, both legal and illegal, of amphetamine use. I think it's a profound worry about what exactly it does to performance in terms of the element of human judgment and the need to use military force, the need to use violence and lethality in carefully honed ways.
So there's another angle that I want to introduce, which Claire kind of opens up. There's a long and complicated history of the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and our topic today. So you think of Merck and morphine, or around 1900, Bayer was really excited about heroin, really excited about heroin. They had this other drug called aspirin, which was secondary, but that one turned out to be also quite a winner. LSD, formerly known as LSD 25 when I was growing up, was developed at Sandoz in Switzerland. And I teach about a famous Harvard professor of anesthesiology named Henry Beecher, who in the early 1950s used LSD as a control drug in his anesthesiology studies. And at the same time also did at least one DOD funded study on LSD in his lab at Mass General. So there is a very intimate relationship between the pharmaceutical industry in the civilian world, awash with amphetamines, as you say. As I said to my daughter, people are always changing their consciousness. And if we make this stuff available, they will use it. Can I say one other thing about the problem of contextualizing what the actual effects of this stuff is? So you go back to after the Vietnam War, there were a bunch of sociologists who went out and looked at follow-ups of men, they were virtually all men, who had used heroin in Vietnam. And as many as 50% of American infantrymen were using heroin or some opioid. in Vietnam, which is pretty stunning, right? We always think about it as they're smoking dope because, you know, of the big movie, but a lot of it was heroin. So they did these follow-ups, and it's quite interesting that a relatively small number of these men were using heroin when they got home. Some did. One study is maybe 5% as compared to 50%. So it's not just the chemical, right? It's the situation in which you're using it and what the context is doing to you that triggers something and triggers, in some cases, a continuing need.
Yeah, if I can just very briefly add to what Jonathan says, we should also put on the table the fact that there's a lot of experimentation these days with certain kinds of drugs to help with PTSD, such as psilocybin. And there's fairly strong evidence now emerging that psilocybin use really can help deal with trauma when properly used under the right kind of supervision and so on. So, I mean, we can't, you know, and then the unwillingness to use certain drugs to help with military-induced PTSD is also an ethical question, right? So if I can't just sit here and take an anti-drug approach across the board because the ethics cuts both ways. So I think we do have to keep that in mind.
If I may pick up Jonathan's point, I think it's a profound point because we tend to look at the history of drugs and war from our contemporary perspective, our lenses, right? All these substances are controlled and illegal for civilians, except for medical purposes. But when we get back to the 19th century, I mean, opium was a basis of pharmacy, right? The same was the case with cocaine in the early 20th century. The same was the case with amphetamines. They became prescribed drugs in the US in 1951, I guess. So, I mean, we are talking about practices of drug taking within the military, which was by no means different when it comes to the society.
And we have scarcely mentioned alcohol, which of course is, you know, rife in both settings as well.
Well, alcohol is the, I wouldn't say it's the oldest, because probably opium was the oldest intoxicant of war, but the most common and widespread. And well, until the mid of the 20th century, I mean, it was totally unimaginable for the commanders to you know, move their soldiers to battle without dispensing them daily rations of alcohol. Nations had their drink of choice. I mean, it was wine for the ancient Greeks and Romans. It was vodka for the Russians and then Soviets. It was whiskey for the Americans until the Civil War, I guess. Afterwards, it became it was rum and then whiskey. It was rum for the British. I mean, every nation had its drink of choice, without supplying troops with daily rations, you could risk, you know, insubordination. So wars were hardly fought sober.
Lukasz, in the book, I think you describe vodka for Soviet Red Army soldiers in World War II. I think you say was kind of the high end, right? That was the high end source of alcohol, but some of them, when they were trying to get back to Germany, were drinking like kerosene. They were drinking right fluids that were used in trucks, right? They were using gasoline, anything they could that had any alcohol in it that could be an intoxicant. They were so desperate.
And this is the problem of turning approved use of alcohol into a problem, because it wasn't, for instance, when it's looking at the Vietnam War, it wasn't heroin or marijuana which generated the real drug problem. It was alcohol. The same was the case with the Wehrmacht army during the Second World War. Drunkenness was a real problem, not to mention the Soviets, the Red Army, and so on and so forth. There's a book by Winston Churchill's private physician, Lord Moran, The Anatomy of Courage. And he describes courage as a kind of capital we have a limited amount of this capital, and soldiers are spending all the time. But there is one way to recharge, like with some liquid additional doses, but there is also a risk because you cannot save it for later use. You have to consume it, so you have to recharge and recharge and recharge, which often leads to habit forming and addiction.
So this makes me think that there are at least two settings. I started out by saying war is constituted of these really long periods of boredom and then these intense moments of fighting, right? And it seems to me that drugs / alcohol, intoxicants of various kinds have a slightly different role in each of these settings and may face different ethical concerns in each one of these settings. So managing the boredom on the one hand versus the firefight on the other. Is there anything that you would like to say to kind of address those very distinct settings, both of which are a big part of war?
I would add another one from the individual perspective. Self-prescribed or self-medication was often caused by soldiers' drive to remain sane, like, coping with the horrors of war, trying to forget the killing and, all these horrible things that you are experiencing and you're a part of. Talking about the Vietnam soldiers, 37% said of the veterans that were interviewed that they took heroin and other intoxicants to remain, mentally well. So obviously it's a trick, right? Because intoxicants do not heal, but they can kind of numb symptoms for a while. And then the problem, like post-traumatic stress disorder, may erupt. But what counts in war is like short-term perspective.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it's been widely reported that the Russian army is battling huge problems with drunkenness right now, and why, to the extent that they are, and to a greater extent than the Ukrainian army is, because the soldiers don't believe in what they're doing, right? They don't want to be there. They don't think that they're fighting a just cause. So question, and this sort of goes to in a very vague way some of my worries about the use of self-drugging in one direction or another, or even worse, imposed drugging in war. Doesn't it work counter to the integrity training and to both the laws of war, the ethics of war that we try so hard to instill, and that when our military is at its best, we can admire so much, right? The character training that, connects courage and the will to fight with the belief in what we are doing. If we have to numb ourselves into oblivion in order to fight our wars, something is wrong either with our training or with our wars, and we need to be able to face that squarely.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Would you like to add anything, Jonathan?
Well, yes and no. Propaganda works pretty well too. And propaganda works pretty well too. And for at least some of the Russian warfighters, they clearly believe in what they're doing. So I think it's a pretty complicated setting, and we don't really have a clear understanding of what's going on over there right now. Yes, I think. Look, I think in this country we do have a sense that we want to be naturalistic in our preparation of our warfighters. We want them to believe, and if you attend any of the war colleges, you're in Annapolis, or you're in Colorado, in the Air Force Academy, or at West Point, you're taking several ethics courses. I don't think Penn requires several ethics courses. If they did, our department would be a lot busier. But at the service academies, you're required to take ethics courses, and the principles that you have enunciated are part of that education. And I think also, going back to what Lukasz's point, I think you said that Americans have been relatively Calvinistic about alcohol. Is that right? At least in recent years, or compared to the rum ration?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, which I think is quite interesting, because we do have this sense that I don't know where it comes from. I'm not enough of an American studies person to know. We do have this sense that somehow there's a naturalness and a nobility to what our soldiers are doing.
Be thinking about a question you might have, because I'm going to ask one more question and then I want to open it up to the audience, but just, just get ready and take a place over there by the by the microphone over there by the window when you are ready. But before I want to just add one more question, put one more question on the table. Can the panel say just a little bit more about the long-term societal consequences, if any, that flow from the rampant use of certain kinds of intoxicants on the battlefield?
I would make a couple of points. The first, very general and historical. War has been a prominent force of spreading various drugs within societies and also globally. The second, very often soldiers returning to civilian life brought their habits back home and also spread it and continued. So this is how different drugs have been popularized. Just to give you an example of Japan, after the Second World War, there are tons and piles of methamphetamine, which soldiers took with them when getting back home. And some of them were destroyed by the US headquarters, but some were taken over by gangs, the raising underworld, like Yakuza, for instance, which is, well, how it all started with the meth remaining from the Second World War. And I think that's it.
Well, there's one more drug I want to mention before caffeine. Right. So during the Civil War, there was a lust for caffeine. And so when Union and Confederate soldiers were out in the field, they would do anything to find a weed or something that they could use that would give them the sense that they were drinking coffee. So, and I will just mention the fact that, as many people know, the tobacco industry sent millions and millions and millions of packages of cigarettes to soldiers. This is brilliant. They got them hooked while they were at war. It was just extraordinary how effective that was.
So I would just sort of close by saying a couple of things. First of all, of course, we need every advantage on the battlefield that we can get. And if we were fighting in Ukraine right now, or if I were deciding policy for the Ukrainian army, and there was plausible evidence to suggest that widely distributing amphetamines to Ukrainian soldiers would help them be victorious against the Russians, I'd have a hard time denying it. However, I do worry. A lot of things start in the military and fan out from there, right? And some are good things, like integration, and some are bad things, right? And one of the things that we see so profoundly right now in the wake of 20 plus years of fighting terrorism is that we have massive PTSD across the country, across those who have been deployed, and repeated deployments. Such a small segment of our population having to go back and back and back. And the massive amount of PTSD, I think, is potentially, and here I'm just sort of spitballing because again, we need empirical evidence on this, is not going to be helped by drugging people into kinds and levels of combat that they can't prepare for through proper training and proper exercise. So I worry that we're creating broader societal problems by lowering inhibitions to war and of course by increasing the lethality of war potentially. That is an argument that potentially proves too much, because any enhancement that we use, even exoskeletons or better armor or better weapons, you can make the same argument about, but I think it's certainly something we have to consider in this context.
Great, thank you very much. Now look at the interest we have here. So we're going to turn to the audience. If you want to identify yourself, terrific. If you don't want to, that's fine too. And I'm going to ask if you might direct it towards somebody, just so that not all three of them feel like they need to answer it. You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
And that way they'll give a more crisp answer because of our time and our interest. So please.
So Jesse Hamilton, fourth year philosophy PhD student. Sorry. So my question is for Professor Finkelstein. So we talk about performance enhancement, and I'm going to state something probably too strongly, but I'm a former U.S. Army drill sergeant, and perhaps drill sergeants are the original performance enhancers.
Yeah, right.
I changed my trainees' bodies. I made them do lots of push-ups. They were not permitted to eat chocolate cake. I made sure that they ate their vegetables. All this is true. I probably enhanced their minds so they paid attention to detail, and they left performing at a much higher level, both technically and physically as a soldier. So, you have that type of performance enhancement on the one end, then you have the methamphetamines on the other, and then you have what Professor Moreno talked about, caffeine, or as I was discussing with someone earlier, the energy drinks that soldiers have access to in combat. And so I thought maybe you could talk about where do we draw the line?
Jesse, I was glad to see that you were here because I know that Jesse knows a lot about this subject and has helped with a volume that Searle is putting out on PTSD. So I'm sure he would have a lot more to say about this, but you're absolutely right. There's of course, a scale of enhancements. And so that's why I said, in some sense, the argument proves too much. There's a range of enhancements, but the kind of drill sergeant that you were, and we know that actually drill sergeants can go too far, right? But the kind of drill sergeant you were was making your folks better people, right? Was making them stronger, it was making them more resilient, was ultimately probably helping them to avoid PTSD, reducing their susceptibility to PTSD, and therefore helping to strengthen both their bodies and their minds, so that when they got out on the other side, they'd be hopefully the better for the experience. Now, we can't always guarantee that, but I doubt that would be the case with amphetamines. I worry about that, right? Are they going to come out addicted? Are they going to come out burned out? The sleeplessness on amphetamines, the collapse after the high is off, all of that then tends to lead to other forms of necessary treatment, other sorts of, medicinal interventions and so on. So, I mean, I would sort of start with the well-being of the soldier as at least a place to begin thinking about this, because when we're building well and healthy soldiers, we're actually in the long run building better readiness and military discipline.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
My name is Louis Padullo. I'm an adjunct faculty member here. I teach product design, my retirement. I have a question really out of ignorance, I suppose, for the book author, which is, drugs are known. There are certainly known to be a performance-enhancing drugs. And in sports, in the Olympics in particular, and in professional sports that we have, people make an agreement not to do that, to balance the field. So, and then in war, we have the Geneva Convention where people outlaw certain kinds of things. They just say, even though war is hell, this, and this you shouldn't do, and you can't do. In fact, if you lose, we're going to try you and hang you for doing that. So has there never been a movement, say in the Geneva Convention world, to ban performance-enhancing drugs for the reasons that most of you have articulated already? Namely, to compare your judgment so you may do some heinous thing, as opposed to, that's my excuse. I was drugged. I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing.
Lucas?
Well, great question. as to my knowledge, there were no such initiatives, but let's keep one thing in mind. It's not like everybody taking as much as they like, right? So those procedures were quite early established within the military. The other thing is whether soldiers, followed them. But as early as in 1939, the German headquarters established guidelines for using methamphetamine. The same was with the American, the British, and it's also today when it comes to the use of modafinil among US pilots. So it's strictly context related. It's usually available for a certain mission. It has to go through different levels of approval, including surgeons, and it's within safe dosages. So it's like we stuck with amphetamines. So when dextroamphetamine was available until 2017, the maximum daily dosage was like between 30 and 60 milligrams. And just to compare it with Adderall and other amphetamine-like medicines for hyperactive disorders, it was like similar, 40 milligrams for children. So, it was quite safe when guidance were followed and instructions were followed.
Great.
It's interesting that the Chemical Weapons Convention does not cover this use of chemicals, which is a really nice point. A colleague in the UK, Malcolm Dando, has pointed out that the more we're learning about the mechanics of the brain and central nervous system, that's great for therapies, right, for people who have various disorders, but it also means that it's another form of vulnerability. If you can figure out how to weaponize systems or devices or drugs that can exploit those understanding of those mechanisms. So that is something I think that is out there. It's a good question.
Yes.
Hi, I suppose this question is for you, Professor Kaminsky. The New York Times has broken several stories over the past year about drug use in the Navy SEAL training pipeline. The sailors use various amphetamines and other drugs to endure the harsh conditions of the BUDS training. I was wondering if you might comment on some of the ethical and moral problems that this presents. Thank you.
Thank you. It's not really known to me, but the ethical problems would be the same as with all examples of self-prescribed drugs. I mean, it's again this dilemma between benefits and harms. I mean, let's face it. We should kind of emphasize with and feel the experience of soldiers on the front line. Like, can you imagine yourself being right now somewhere in Donbass under continuous bomb shelling? I mean, there are many volunteers, non-Ukrainian, who say that they cannot stay for a long time, and they just quit. So we offer medical treatment for soldiers who are wounded, but we have some moral quarrels when it comes to their self-medication, when it comes to mental health. I mean, this is something I'm not that much against. My approach is more liberal, but it comes from a historical perspective, and kind of we should take the individual level as well.
Great, thank you. I see we have 2.5 minutes left and 2 questions. I'm going to ask you to both ask your questions and then turn it back to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm a trained historian, and I'm working on a project about veterans from the First World War, particularly Germans who developed morphine addictions. And I'm just curious because I've thought of this question in my own research. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do, but as a historian, what are the ethics about telling someone's addiction stories if they're not here to give you their permission to do so? I am encountering a lot of the secondary sources, I think, rely on what experts in those days said, but I am encountering like case studies or police reports, and maybe they're no longer living, but is there sort of an ethical way to do that?
Great. And one more question, and then we'll turn it back.
Helen Fry from Stockholm University. So we seem to be assuming that the fact that a drug is performance enhancing is a benefit, but I'm just thinking that's only true if your combatants are fighting a justified war, right? Because if you're fighting an unjustified war, the fact that you're more likely to win seems like a pretty serious moral objection to the use of the drugs. So I'm just wondering if in fact the main objection to the use of these drugs is that given, say, for example, if you look at the United States' recent history of war, so Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, if we think those were unjustified wars, the fact that you're giving soldiers things that make them more likely to win their unjustified wars seems like that's a sort of decisive moral objection, we might think.
All right, now we turn it back to the panel. Do you each want to make some very brief closing comments, maybe handling those questions briefly?
I'd love to respond to Helen's really excellent point, which is absolutely. And I think that in an unjust war, you're more likely to find dependence on those drugs. And so therefore, it's more likely actually to give a benefit to the unjust side because they have that much more need for them, as it were. And that was really my comment about the Russians and their drunkenness, though I think in that case, it's likely not performance enhancing. But the idea that we might actually have a ban on them strikes me as highly unlikely, given that there are certainly going to be uses of them that are medically justifiable and indicated, so long as we still end up prescribing it for people with ADHD and so on.
Lucas?
Um,
Maybe the historical question.
The morphine addiction was pretty common beginning from the Civil War, the US Civil War, then the Franco-Prussian War and the First World War. The problem with conflicts before the Second World War is the lack of records. So, there is, when it comes to, for instance, the use of cocaine, is much more like wishful thinking that we can get into the real details. And the same is with morphine. Soldiers were often marked with the red cross on their forehand, just to avoid double dosage of morphine when it came to the treatment. No records, I would say, can reveal the scale of the use of morphine, because also soldiers had it in their medical kits. So
the ethics about using case studies is quite interesting, and we should talk more about that. Historical case studies generally are, considered to be acceptable. The person's no longer living. Nonetheless, there's an element of respect. And so there's a way of doing that, I think, textually and in your footnotes, which are really what count as a scholar. And I will just add by saying again how delighted I am that Łukasz was able to be with us today. He had a grant from the Polish government, I think a couple of years ago, and couldn't come for various reasons. And now he's here and we want to get him back. So let's find a way to bring Łukasz back to Penn.
Thanks so much. I won't keep you all, but just to say again, for Łukasz, for Claire, for Jonathan, for Beth, it was an extraordinary panel. I want to give them another round of applause from you all. I also want to say that part of the World Today's mission is not only to bring you the things you know about, but the things you don't know about. And I don't imagine that before you saw the advertisement for today's program that you'd actually thought about. Many of you may have, but I'm imagining there's some of you who have not. And that part of what today's program did was a real unlayering of this issue for you from very different perspectives, to remind you that while you might not have thought about this, that you should be thinking about this going forward. And there are both ethical, political, moral, physical elements to this. And one of the questions I would have asked had there been time was, what happens when we arrive at this day when someone gets accused of a war crime or a crime against humanity? And there's the argument that the drug, the intervention, the enhancement made me do it. Where does culpability and responsibility lie in those future instances, which will inevitably happen? So as we go forward and think about the policy world out there that's governing this, these are real questions for us to be considering from a policy perspective that have, again, kind of lots of complicated dimensions to them. So I want to thank our panelists, and I also wanted to let you all know that you should be back here tomorrow in these same chairs for some future programming. We're launching a new series called Critical Conversations. The first one will start tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and it will examine the question of reparations and whether reparations are a reasonable way to, or whether they can redress the harms of colonization and slavery. That discussion will be moderated by a journalist from the Washington Post, whose name is Deneen Brown. And on either side of that question, you will have Jeremy Black, who's an emeritus professor of history at the University of Exeter, and Jeremy Sarkin, a distinguished research professor of law at Nova University in Lisbon. So we hope you will come back and join us for that. It will be very interactive, meaning that the audience will vote at the top of the program about where they stand on the question of reparations, and they will vote at the end of the program to see if civil discourse, facts, and two people genuinely talking about an issue can influence how you think about something. There will be voting online as well. So for those of you who are on Zoom, we hope you'll come back. So as usual, you can find this program on YouTube in a couple of days. It'll be posted like all of our programs here at Perry Waldhouse. And you can follow us for future events by going to our website, joining our mailing list, and following us on social media. And there's a grab and go snack for those of you here in the room. We thank our panel again.